The wind hit Maria Delgado like a slap the moment she stepped out of the diner. Her car had died in the parking lot an hour ago, and now she had no choice but to walk home through a storm that was getting worse by the minute. Snow stung her cheeks. Her shoes, already worn thin at the soles, soaked through within the first block. She pulled her coat tighter and pushed forward, counting the streetlights the way she always did when the cold became too much to think about. She was 3 blocks from her apartment when she saw him. An old man sat alone on a bench outside a shuttered bakery, his back straight despite the cold, his hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for a bus that would never come. He wore no coat, no hat, no gloves, just a thin gray sweater that did nothing against a night like this. Snow had already gathered on his shoulders, and his skin had gone the pale blue color that Maria recognized from her years working the night shift, the color that meant a body was losing its fight with the cold. She almost kept walking. She had 2 kids waiting for her at home, a stack of bills on the kitchen counter, and barely enough energy left to make it up 3 flights of stairs. But something about the way he sat there, so still, so alone, made her stop. "Sir?" she said, crouching in front of him. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they found her face. He tried to speak, but his lips were too stiff from the cold to form words clearly. "I'm fine," he finally managed. "Please, don't trouble yourself." "You're not fine. You're freezing." Maria was already pulling off her scarf, wrapping it around his neck with hands that shook from her own cold. "Where's your family? Someone who can come get you." He didn't answer. He looked down at his hands instead, like the question had touched something he didn't want to touch. "Okay," Maria said, mostly to herself. "Okay, come on. My place isn't far. We'll get you warm, and we'll figure out the rest after." "I couldn't ask that of you." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." She stood and held out her hand. "What's your name?" He hesitated so long that she thought he might not answer at all. "Walter," he said finally. "You can call me Walter." There was something careful in the way he said it, like he was choosing which name to give her, but Maria was too cold and too worried to notice it clearly. She helped him to his feet, surprised at how light he felt for a man his height, and looped his arm through hers. The walk to her apartment took twice as long as it should have. Walter's steps were slow and uneven, and twice he nearly went down on the icy sidewalk before Maria caught him. By the time they reached her building, both of them were shaking so hard their teeth clattered. Her apartment was small, 2 bedrooms for 3 people, with a kitchen that doubled as a hallway, and a heater that worked only if you hit it in the right spot. But it was warm compared to the street, and the moment they walked in, her son Noah looked up from his homework at the table. "Mom, who's that?" "This is Walter. He's going to warm up here for a bit." Maria was already moving, grabbing the blanket off the couch, filling the kettle, checking the thermostat. "Lily, baby, can you grab the extra blanket from my closet?" Her daughter, 7 years old and endlessly curious, appeared in the doorway of her room and stared at the old man now sitting stiffly on their couch, snow still melting in his thinning white hair. "Are you lost?" Lily asked him. Walter looked at her for a long moment, something soft crossing his face. "In a manner of speaking, yes," he said. "I suppose I am." Maria brought him a mug of hot tea and watched his hands close around it, still trembling. She sat across from him on the arm of the worn recliner, studying his face now that the porch light and kitchen bulb gave her a proper look at him. He was older than she'd first guessed, maybe in his 70s, with sharp blue eyes that didn't match the confusion he'd shown on the bench. His hands, she noticed, were smooth, not the hands of someone who had spent a life doing hard labor. His nails were trimmed and clean. Even his sweater, worn as it looked, was made of a fabric finer than anything Maria owned. "Do you have family somewhere, Walter?" she asked gently. "Someone I should call?" His jaw tightened. "No one who would come tonight." "What about a shelter you were staying at? Somewhere you need to get back to?" "I was simply walking," he said. "I lost track of time. It happens, at my age." Maria didn't believe that for a second, but she also knew better than to push a frightened old man on the worst night he'd had in a while. She'd seen enough regulars at the diner, enough tired faces hiding enough tired stories, to know that people revealed themselves only when they were ready. Well, you're not walking anywhere else tonight, she said, standing. Noah, can you help me pull out the folding cot? I don't want to impose, Walter said quickly. Truly, if you could simply point me toward a shelter. In this weather, at your age? Not a chance. Maria was already moving toward the hall closet. You'll stay tonight. We'll sort out the rest tomorrow, when the storms died down and we can all think straight. Walter didn't argue again. Maybe he was too tired to. Maybe some part of him understood that arguing with Maria Delgado on her own turf was a fight he wouldn't win. Dinner that night was thin vegetable soup, stretched further than Maria had planned so there would be enough for 4 instead of 3. She gave Walter the largest portion without asking, the way she gave the largest portion to her children without thinking twice about it. He ate slowly, carefully, and thanked her 3 times before the bowl was empty. This is very good, he said. Better than I've had in a long while. It's just soup, Maria said, though something in his voice made her wonder what kind of meals he was used to. After dinner, Noah showed Walter his half-finished model airplane, explaining each piece with the seriousness only an 11-year-old boy can bring to plastic and glue. Walter listened with real attention, asking questions that made Noah's chest puff out with pride. Lily brought over a drawing she'd made at school, a family of stick figures under a yellow sun, and Walter studied it like it was a piece in a museum. You have talented children, he told Maria later, once the kids had gone to bed and the apartment had gone quiet, except for the wind outside. They're good kids, she agreed. It's just the 3 of us, but we make it work. Their father? Not in the picture. Hasn't been for years. She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, the way you say a fact you've made peace with a long time ago. Walter nodded slowly, and for a moment his eyes drifted to the window, to the snow still falling outside. Family, he said quietly, is a complicated thing. You want to talk about it? Not tonight, he said. If that's all right. That's all right. Maria stood and pulled the folding cot from where Noah had set it up in the living room, arranging the extra blanket over it. Get some sleep, Walter. Things always look less frightening in the morning. Thank you, he said, and something in the way he said it made it sound like he meant more than just the blanket. I don't know why you did this, a stranger, on a night like tonight. Maria paused at the hallway, looking back at him. Because nobody should be alone in the cold, she said simply. Not if I can help it. She went to bed that night, thinking she'd done a good deed, and that in the morning, someone would come looking for the confused old man on her couch, a worried family member, a shelter worker, someone. She had no idea, lying there in the dark listening to the storm rattle her windows, that the man sleeping in her living room was about to change everything about her life, and that the biggest secrets were still hours away from being told. She woke before dawn out of habit, the way she always did before an early shift, and found Walter already awake, sitting at her kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of water, since he hadn't wanted to help himself to more of her tea. He looked embarrassed to be caught awake, like he'd been trying not to be any trouble at all. Couldn't sleep? She asked, starting the coffee maker. I'm not used to sleeping anywhere but my own bed, he admitted. Old habits. Well, the storm's still going, so you're stuck with us a bit longer. She glanced out the window at the white world beyond the glass. Snow had piled up against the fire escape, thick and undisturbed. I need to call the diner and let them know I can't make it in. And I should probably call the shelter downtown, see if anyone's reported someone missing. Something flickered across Walter's face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. There's no rush, he said. Surely the roads need to clear first. Right, no rush. She studied him for a moment, the way his shoulders had gone tense at the mention of calling anyone, the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. There was more to this man than a confused elderly gentleman who'd lost track of time on a snowy night. She could feel it in the careful way he spoke, in the questions he dodged, in the fine sweater that didn't belong to a man sleeping outside. But she had 2 kids to get ready for a snow day, oatmeal to make, and a missed shift to explain to her manager. Whatever secrets Walter was carrying would have to wait. She didn't know yet how many secrets there were, or how far they reached, or that the man on her couch was about to turn her whole world upside down, in ways she never could have imagined on that first cold night, when all she'd wanted was to get him out of the snow. By mid-morning, The snow had slowed to a light drift, and the apartment had settled into the easy rhythm of a house with nowhere to be. Noah sat cross-legged on the floor, finishing his airplane, while Walter watched from the couch, offering quiet suggestions about balance and weight that turned out to be surprisingly useful. Lily had claimed a spot at Walter's feet with a coloring book, narrating every choice of color as if he needed to approve each one. "Why don't you have a coat?" she asked him at one point, looking up with the blunt honesty only a child can manage. Walter's hands went still on his knee. "I left home in a hurry," he said. "I wasn't thinking clearly." "Where's your home?" "Lily," Maria said gently from the kitchen. "Let the man breathe." "It's all right," Walter said, though his eyes had gone distant again, the same way they had the night before when Maria asked about his family. "It's a fair question, young lady. I simply don't have a good answer for it today." Maria watched the exchange while she dried the breakfast dishes, filing away every small detail the way she filed away orders at the diner, quick and automatic. A man who left home in a hurry, a man who wasn't thinking clearly, a man who wouldn't say where home was, or who might be looking for him. She dried her hands, and came to sit on the arm of the couch. "Walter, I don't mean to pry, but if there's someone out there worried sick about you, I want to help you get back to them. That's all this is." "I understand," he said. "And I'm grateful, truly. But there isn't anyone worried, I don't think. Not the way you mean. Everyone has someone. Some of us used up our someones a long time ago." He said it lightly, almost like a joke, but there was no humor in his eyes when he said it, and Maria decided not to push any further that morning. She spent the early afternoon on the phone anyway, calling the 2 shelters within walking distance and the local police non-emergency line, describing an elderly man found disoriented near the old bakery on 5th Street. No one had a matching report. No missing persons call, no family inquiry. It was as if Walter had simply appeared out of the snow, with no past and no one looking for him, and the strangeness of that sat uneasily in Maria's chest, even as she told herself it wasn't her problem to solve. Around 2 in the afternoon, her phone rang. It was Grace, her manager at the diner, checking in about the missed shift and letting her know they'd need her back the moment the roads cleared, storm or no storm, because the diner was already short 2 servers for the week. Maria promised to be there the next morning and hung up, already doing the math in her head. The math she did every single day. How many hours she needed, how much the bills would eat, how far the last paycheck would stretch before the next one arrived. She didn't notice Walter watching her face during the call until she set the phone down. "You carry a great deal," he said quietly. "Everybody carries something. Not everybody carries it the way you do. With your chin up the whole time." He looked toward the kitchen, toward the mostly bare cabinets, toward the stack of bills weighted down by a coffee mug on the counter. "I noticed the mail earlier. I hope you don't mind. I wasn't prying, only sitting near it." Maria felt her face warm, not from embarrassment exactly, but from the strange discomfort of being seen so clearly by a man she'd known less than a day. "It's fine. It's not a secret. Things are tight. They've been tight for a while. We manage. You do more than manage. You opened your door to a stranger last night when you had every reason not to." "Anyone would have done that." "No," Walter said, and something in his voice had shifted, gone lower and more certain. "Very few people would have done that. I've lived a long time, Maria. I've met a great many people. Very few of them would have stopped for a man on a bench in a storm like that one." She didn't know what to say to that, so she busied herself refilling his water glass instead, and the conversation drifted back to safer things. Noah's airplane, Lily's drawings, the weather report promising clearer skies by evening. But that night, after the children were in bed and the apartment had gone quiet again, Maria found herself standing in the hallway outside the living room, watching Walter through the gap in the doorway. He sat very still on the folding cot, staring at his own hands in the dim light from the street lamp outside, and for just a moment, before he noticed her there, his face carried an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Not confusion, not gratitude, something closer to grief, deep and old, the kind that lives in a person for years before it finally shows itself on a night when the walls have come down. She went to bed without saying anything, telling herself it wasn't her business, that a man was allowed his private sorrow, that in a day or two he'd be back with whoever he belonged to, and her life would return to its normal shape of shifts and homework, and stretching every dollar as far as it would go. She had no idea, as she drifted off to sleep, with the wind finally dying down outside her window, that the quiet grief on Walter's face was only the surface of something much larger, something that would soon pull her entire family into a storm far more dangerous than the one that had brought him to her door. The knock came at 7 in the morning, sharp and impatient, and Maria's stomach dropped before she even reached the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and unexpected knocks rarely meant good news. It was her landlord, Mr. Carter, standing in the hallway with a clipboard and an expression that told her this wasn't a friendly visit. "Got a complaint from Unit 6 about extra noise coming from your place," he said without any greeting. "Told me you've got someone staying here who's not on the lease." "He's a guest, Mr. Carter. An elderly man I found in the storm. He'll be gone as soon as the weather clears, and I can help him get sorted. Lease says no unauthorized long-term guests. You know that." "It's been one night," Maria said, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse climbed. "Two now. That's not long-term." Mr. Carter's eyes drifted past her shoulder, into the apartment, where Walter sat at the kitchen table with Lily showing him her math homework. Something crossed his face, brief and unreadable, before he looked back at Maria. "Keep it short," he said. "I don't want this becoming a habit. And if Unit 6 complains again, we're going to have a bigger conversation about your lease." He left without waiting for a response, and Maria closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever something threatened the fragile balance she'd built for her family. One complaint, one conversation. That was all it took to remind her how little cushion she had beneath her feet. "I'm sorry," Walter said quietly from the table. He'd clearly heard every word. "I've caused you trouble. I should go." "You're not going anywhere in this cold, with nowhere to be," Maria said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "We'll figure it out. I don't want to be the reason you lose your home." "You won't be." She said it firmly, more to convince herself than him, and went to start breakfast, pushing the worry down the way she pushed down every worry, filing it behind the next task and the one after that. That afternoon, with the roads finally clear enough for walking, Maria decided to try the shelter downtown in person instead of over the phone. She left the children with a neighbor, Mrs. Patel from down the hall, who'd watched Noah and Lily plenty of times before, and walked the 6 blocks with Walter beside her, moving slowly but steadily now that he'd had 2 days of rest and food. The shelter was a squat brick building with a line already forming outside, despite the early hour. Maria spoke to the woman at the front desk, describing Walter's situation, asking about any reports of a missing elderly man matching his description. The woman checked her lists twice and shook her head both times. "Nothing matching that description has come through," she said. "You're welcome to leave his information in case something comes in, but honestly, if nobody's reported him in 2 days, in this weather, that's unusual. Most families report within hours." Maria glanced at Walter, who stood a few steps back, his face carefully blank, and something about his stillness told her he already knew what the woman was going to say before she said it. "Walter," Maria said once they were back outside, the cold air biting at her cheeks, "you're not surprised by that?" He didn't answer right away. They walked half a block in silence before he finally spoke. "I didn't leave home because I was lost, Maria. I want you to know that. I left on purpose." On purpose? There are things happening in my life that I wasn't prepared to face. I made a choice, a foolish one, to simply walk away from all of it. I didn't plan for the storm. I didn't plan to end up on a bench, freezing, with nowhere to go, but the leaving itself was intentional. He kept his eyes forward, on the sidewalk ahead of them, unable to meet her gaze. "I understand if that changes how you see all of this. If you'd rather I find somewhere else to stay tonight." Maria studied his profile as they walked, the careful set of his jaw, the way his hands, gloveless again since he'd insisted Lily keep the mittens Maria had lent him, were tucked deep into the pockets of a coat borrowed from her own closet, one that had belonged to her father years ago. Whatever Walter was running from, It clearly weighed on him in a way that went far beyond simple confusion or a bad night. "Everybody runs from something sometimes," she said finally. "Doesn't mean you're a bad person for needing a night to catch your breath. It's been 3 days now, though, Walter. Whatever it is, it's not going to solve itself while you're sleeping on my couch." "No," he agreed quietly. "I imagine it isn't. You don't have to tell me what it is, but you should think about facing it." "Whatever it is," she said it gently, the way she might say it to Noah when he was avoiding a hard conversation about school, and Walter gave a small, tired laugh. "You sound like someone who has given that advice to a child before." "Every day," Maria said, and for the first time that afternoon, a real smile crossed her face. That evening, back at the apartment, Maria noticed things she hadn't paid attention to before. The way Walter helped Noah with a math problem using a method the boy's teacher hadn't taught, a method that clearly came from years of dealing with numbers far larger than schoolwork. The way he corrected himself mid-sentence once, starting to say something about the quarterly figures before catching himself and changing the subject entirely. The way his shoes, worn as they'd become after the walk through the snow, were clearly expensive, a brand Maria recognized from the wealthy customers who occasionally wandered into the diner and left generous tips without noticing they'd done it. None of it added up to a man with nowhere to go. None of it matched a man who slept outside on freezing nights with no coat. She didn't confront him about it that night. Instead, she watched and waited and let him settle deeper into the small rhythms of her household, helping Lily with her reading before bed, drying dishes while Maria washed them, sitting quietly with a cup of tea after the children were asleep, watching the news with an intensity that suggested he was looking for something specific, though he never said what. On the fourth night, Maria woke to the sound of low voices from the living room. She crept toward the hallway, heart pounding, and found Walter on the phone, his back to her, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "I need more time," he was saying. "I know what I asked you to do, and I need you to hold off a little longer. No, I haven't decided anything yet. Please, just a few more days." Maria stepped back into the shadow of the hallway before he could see her, her mind racing. A phone call meant someone did know where he was, or at least someone he trusted enough to call. A phone call meant Walter wasn't as alone in the world as he'd let her believe. She went back to bed without confronting him, turning the pieces over in her mind long after the apartment had gone silent again. Whoever Walter really was, whatever he was running from, it was bigger than a lonely old man losing his way in a storm. And after 5 days under her roof, filling her home with a warmth she hadn't expected and hadn't asked for, Maria realized she had grown attached to a man whose true identity she still didn't know at all. Before that morning arrived, though, there was still the rest of the fourth day to get through, and it brought its own share of trouble. Maria's shift at the diner ran long, a double she hadn't planned on taking, but couldn't afford to turn down when Grace offered it. By the time she walked through her front door that evening, her feet ached, and her back had the familiar dull throb that came from 12 hours on her feet, but the apartment smelled like something warm and unfamiliar, and for a moment, she stood frozen in the doorway trying to place it. "I hope you don't mind," Walter said, appearing from the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder, looking almost sheepish. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Patel, was kind enough to share a few ingredients, and I thought the children might enjoy something different." On the table sat a proper meal, roasted vegetables, and a simple chicken dish that smelled like it belonged in a restaurant far nicer than anywhere Maria had eaten in years. Noah and Lily were already seated, practically vibrating with excitement over the unexpected dinner. "You cooked?" Maria asked, setting down her bag slowly. "I used to, many years ago, before life became complicated." Walter pulled out a chair for her, an old-fashioned gesture that felt strange and touching all at once. "I wanted to do something useful. You do so much for all of us. It felt wrong to simply sit here and take without giving anything back." Maria sat, too tired to argue, and the meal that followed was one of the warmest evenings her small apartment had seen in a long time. Walter told the children a story about a garden he'd once kept, elaborate and full of small details that made Lily gasp at the right moments, though he was careful, Maria noticed, never to say where that garden had been or who had helped him tend it. Noah asked him question after question about the business world, having overheard enough of Walter's careful slips to grow curious, and Walter answered in general terms, teaching the boy about supply and demand and hard work without ever revealing anything specific about his own life. After the children went to bed, Maria found herself lingering at the kitchen table instead of heading straight to her room, nursing a cup of tea she didn't really want, just to keep the evening going a little longer. "You're good with them," she said. "Really good. Did you have children of your own?" Walter's hands stilled around his own mug. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer at all. "One," he said finally. "A son." "Where is he now?" "I don't know, precisely. We haven't spoken in nearly 2 years." His voice had gone quiet and careful, the way it did whenever the conversation edged too close to whatever he was hiding. "It's a long story, and not a flattering one, at least not for me. I'm not asking you to flatter yourself. I'm just listening." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "You have a gift for that, Maria. Listening without demanding. It's rarer than you might think, especially among people who have something to gain from what they might hear." "I don't want anything from you, Walter. I just want to make sure you're safe, and that whoever's missing you gets some peace of mind." "No one is missing me the way you imagine," he said, and there was real sadness in it now, raw enough that Maria didn't push further. "That's rather the trouble." She let the conversation rest there, clearing the mugs and wishing him good night, but she carried his words with her to bed, turning them over like stones in her palm. A son he hadn't spoken to in 2 years. A phone call in the middle of the night to someone he'd asked for more time. A newspaper clipping she hadn't yet found, tucked away in a coat pocket, waiting to unravel every careful answer he'd given her. The 5th morning began ordinary enough. Maria woke early to get the children ready for school, now that the roads had cleared enough for the buses to run again, and left Walter with a spare key and firm instructions to rest, since he still tired easily, and the cold had clearly taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. She kissed Noah and Lily goodbye at the bus stop, walked the 6 blocks to the diner in weather that finally felt like ordinary winter instead of a storm trying to bury the whole city, and spent her shift refilling coffee cups and taking orders with her mind half on the strange, gentle man who had somehow become part of her household in less than a week. It was during her lunch break, sitting in the back of the diner with a cup of coffee and 15 stolen minutes to herself, that Grace slid into the booth across from her, curiosity written all over her face. "So who's the mystery man Mrs. Patel keeps talking about? Says you've got some fancy old fellow staying with you, cooking dinners and teaching your kids about the stock market." Maria managed a tired laugh. "It's not like that. I found him outside during the storm. He didn't have anywhere to go." "And he's still there? 5 days later?" "It's complicated." Grace raised an eyebrow, the kind of look that came from years of reading people across a diner counter. "Complicated how?" "I don't think he's telling me everything," Maria admitted, lowering her voice, even though the diner was mostly empty. "Little things don't add up. The way he talks, the clothes he was wearing under that thin sweater. I found a business card in his coat pocket while I was doing laundry the other day, but I put it back before I really looked at it properly. Didn't feel right, going through a man's things while he's a guest in my home." "Maria." Grace's voice had gone serious. "You've got 2 kids in that apartment. I love your big heart, I do, but you need to know who you're letting sleep under the same roof as your babies." I know that." Maria wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, feeling the truth of it settle heavier than it had before. "I'm going to talk to him tonight. Really talk to him. Find out what's actually going on." She meant it when she said it, and she carried that intention with her through the rest of her shift, rehearsing the conversation in her head between orders, deciding how gently and how firmly she needed to press. But when she got home that evening, tired and resolved, she found the laundry basket exactly where she'd left it that morning, still needing to be folded, and as she sorted through the pile, her hand closed around the stiff edge of paper tucked inside the coat pocket she hadn't emptied properly days before. She pulled it out slowly, a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed slightly at the edges, creased from being carried and refolded many times. She smoothed it open on the kitchen table, and her breath caught in her throat as she read the headline, and then the name beneath the photograph of a man who looked remarkably like a younger version of the quiet, gentle stranger, currently sitting in her living room, patiently helping her son with his homework, as though he belonged there. The name on the article did not match the name he had given her. Maria read the headline 3 times before the words fully settled in her mind. The article was nearly a year old, torn from the business section of a major newspaper, and the photograph showed a man standing at a podium in front of a large company logo. His hair a little darker than it was now, his posture the same straight, careful posture she'd noticed on the bench that first snowy night. The caption beneath the photograph named him as the founder and chairman of one of the largest manufacturing companies in the region, a man worth more money than Maria could picture in any real way, a man whose company employed thousands of people across a dozen factories. The name printed beneath his photograph was not Walter. She sat there at the kitchen table for a long time, the clipping trembling slightly in her hands, listening to the sound of Noah and Walter laughing over something in the living room, the easy, comfortable sound of 2 people who had grown fond of each other over the course of a single strange week. Her mind raced through everything that had happened since that first night on the bench, the fine clothes beneath a thin sweater, the careful slips of language about quarterly figures and company matters, the phone call in the middle of the night, the shelter with no report of a missing man matching his description, because nobody had thought to report a billionaire missing, not when he'd left on his own 2 feet and by his own choice. She folded the clipping carefully and walked into the living room, where Walter sat with a book open on his lap, reading aloud to Lily while Noah worked on a puzzle nearby. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression must have told him immediately that whatever careful balance they'd built over the past 5 days had just shifted beneath both their feet. "Lily, sweetheart, can you take Noah and finish getting ready for bed? I need to talk to Walter for a minute." The children sensed the change in the air, the way children always do, and went quietly without their usual protests, leaving Maria and Walter alone in the small living room with the clipping still folded in her hand. "I found this in your coat pocket," she said, setting it on the coffee table between them, "while I was doing the laundry." Walter looked at the folded paper for a long moment, without reaching for it, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual careful composure. "I should have told you sooner, I'm sorry." "That's not you." Maria's voice was steady, but her hands were not. "The name in this article, that's not the name you gave me." "No," he admitted quietly, "it isn't." "So who are you, Walter? Or whatever your name actually is?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his own hands, and when he finally looked up at her, something in his face had changed, the careful mask of confusion and gratitude giving way to something older and heavier, a weariness that had nothing to do with the storm or the cold. "My name is Walter Bennett," he said. "That much was true. I simply left off the rest of it. The company you're looking at in that article, the one with my face at the podium, that's mine. I built it from almost nothing, over 50 years, into something larger than I ever imagined it could become." Maria sat down slowly across from him, the weight of what he was telling her settling over the small living room like a fog. "You're rich." "I am, by most measures, extraordinarily wealthy, yes. And you were sitting on a bench in the snow with no coat. I told you the leaving was intentional. I didn't tell you why, and I'm sorry for that. I owe you the truth now, if you're willing to hear it." He rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly looking every one of his 70-some years. "A week ago, my son and I had a terrible argument, the worst we've ever had, about the future of the company. He wants to sell it, to a group of investors who would strip it down and move the factories overseas, put thousands of people out of work, simply to increase a number on a balance sheet. I refused. He accused me of caring more about my legacy than about my own family, of being stubborn and controlling and unwilling to let go of something I should have handed over years ago. "That doesn't explain the bench," Maria said quietly. "No, it doesn't." Walter's voice cracked slightly, the first real crack Maria had heard in it since the night she found him. "After the argument, I left the house. I told myself I simply needed air, needed to walk and clear my head, the way I've done 1,000 times over the years when things became too much. But I kept walking. I didn't turn back. I think, somewhere in the back of my mind, I wanted to disappear entirely, just for a while, to be nobody, instead of the man everyone needed something from. I didn't plan for the storm. I didn't plan to lose track of the hours, or the cold, or how far I'd walked from anything familiar. By the time I realized how much trouble I was in, I was too proud, or too foolish, to ask anyone for help. And then I found you. And then you found me, he agreed. And you asked for nothing in return. Not my name, not my money, not anything except that I get warm and safe. In 50 years of building a company and shaking hands with powerful people, Maria, I don't believe anyone has ever been that generous with me without wanting something back. Maria sat with that for a long moment, trying to reconcile the gentle, quiet man who had cooked her children dinner and helped Noah with his homework, with the powerful figure in the newspaper photograph. A man who controlled the lives of thousands of employees and appeared in business headlines. It didn't fit together cleanly, and yet somehow, looking at him now, exhausted and honest for the first time since she'd met him, it made a strange kind of sense. "That phone call I heard the other night," she said. "You were asking for more time." His eyebrows rose slightly, surprised she'd caught that. "Yes, that was my assistant, one of the few people who knows where I am. I asked her not to tell my son yet, not until I'd decided what to do." "About the company?" "About everything, the company, my son, the kind of man I want to be for whatever years I have left." He looked at her directly now, his blue eyes clear and steady despite the exhaustion in them. "I've spent 5 days in your home, Maria, watching you work yourself to exhaustion for your children, and never once complain about it. Never once ask the universe for anything beyond what you can earn with your own 2 hands. I've spent more time in genuine conversation with your children this week than I have with my own son in the past 2 years. It has been, quite honestly, humbling." "So what happens now?" Maria asked. "Now that I know who you really are?" "That depends entirely on you," Walter said. "I understand if you'd rather I leave. A man with my kind of money, my kind of complications, brings a different sort of risk into a home than a lonely stranger off the street. I have people who will be looking for me by now, reporters who might catch wind of where I've been staying, a son who may show up here angry and demanding answers I'm not sure I'm ready to give. I won't pretend any of that is simple or fair to bring into your life." Maria thought about her landlord's warning, about the fragile balance of her apartment and her budget, and the careful, exhausting life she'd built for her children. She thought about the way Lily had lit up over the past 5 nights, the way Noah had started asking sharper questions about the world, the way the apartment had felt warmer, in every sense, since Walter arrived. And she thought about the man on the bench that first night, shivering and alone, who had asked for nothing and been given everything anyway, simply because it was the right thing to do. "I didn't help you because of who you are," she said finally. "I helped you because you needed help. That hasn't changed just because I know your name now. Even knowing everything that might come with it. Even then," she met his eyes steadily. "But Walter, if there are people out there worried, if your son is looking for you, you need to let them know you're safe. Whatever's broken between you two, that's not going to heal while he thinks you might be lying dead in a snowbank somewhere. I know a little something about broken families. The silence never fixes anything. It just makes the distance longer." Walter was quiet for a long time, staring at the folded clippings still sitting on the coffee table between them, his own face looking back at him from a life that suddenly felt very far away from the small, warm apartment he'd been living in for the past 5 days. "You're right," he said finally. "I've been hiding, Maria, not just from the storm that first night, but from everything waiting for me back home. I think some part of me knew that the moment I let anyone know where I was, this small, quiet peace I've found here would end, and I'd have to go back to being the man everyone needs something from." "You can still be that man," Maria said gently, "and also be someone worth knowing, the way you've been here this week. Those aren't opposites, Walter. You just have to choose to be both." He looked at her for a long moment, something like gratitude and grief mixing together in his expression, and then he nodded slowly, reaching for his phone on the side table, where it had sat mostly untouched since the night of the storm. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll make the calls tomorrow. Tonight, if it's all right with you, I'd simply like one more quiet evening before everything changes again." Maria nodded and reached over to squeeze his hand briefly, the gesture as natural as it would have been with any old friend, though they'd known each other only 5 days. "Tonight then," she said. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest." That quiet evening turned out to be one of the best either of them would remember. Maria made a simple dinner, nothing fancy, but Walter insisted on helping in the kitchen despite her protests, standing at her side chopping vegetables with careful, practiced hands, while the children set the table and argued cheerfully over whose turn it was to fold the napkins. For a few hours, the weight of the newspaper clipping and everything it meant seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the ordinary comfort of a family, however unusual its shape, sharing a meal together. After dinner, Walter asked if he could speak with Noah alone for a few minutes, and Maria, curious but trusting, agreed. She busied herself in the kitchen, close enough to overhear pieces of their conversation drifting from the living room, Walter's low, steady voice explaining something about hard choices and the weight of responsibility, Noah's higher voice asking careful questions in return. She didn't catch every word, but she caught enough to understand that Walter was talking about his own son, about the argument that had sent him out into the storm, phrased in simple terms a boy of 11 could understand and learn from. Sometimes, she heard Walter say, the people we love the most are also the people we're most afraid of disappointing, and that fear can make us say things, or do things, that we regret. The bravest thing a person can do isn't avoiding that fear. It's facing it anyway, and saying sorry when sorry is what's needed. Maria stood very still at the sink, dish towel forgotten in her hands, struck by how much wisdom the man had folded into a conversation meant for a child, wisdom he clearly hadn't yet found the courage to apply to his own life. Later, after both children had gone to bed, Maria and Walter sat together on the small couch, the television playing quietly in the background, more for company than for anything either of them was actually watching. Walter's phone sat on the table between them, silent for now, though Maria could tell he kept glancing at it every few minutes, bracing himself for whatever tomorrow would bring. "Tell me about him," she said. "Your son. What was he like before all of this?" A small smile crossed Walter's face, the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen from him all evening. Daniel was a curious boy, always taking things apart to see how they worked, always asking why, until his mother and I ran out of answers. I used to bring him to the factory floor on weekends, let him watch the machines, let him ask the workers 1,000 questions. He loved it. He loved the people there, the noise, the sense that something real was being made with your own hands. What happened? Life happened. He grew up. He went to business school, came back with a head full of numbers and efficiency reports, and somewhere along the way, the boy who loved watching machines build things became a man who saw those same machines, and the people who ran them, as line items on a budget. Walter's voice had gone quiet, tinged with a grief that Maria recognized now as something he'd been carrying for a long time, far longer than the past week. I don't entirely blame him. I built a company that measured success in numbers for 50 years. I taught him that language before I taught him any other. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised he speaks it more fluently than the language of loyalty and legacy that I've tried to teach him since. He's still your son, though, underneath all the numbers. I know that. I've always known that. It's remembering it, in the moment, when we're shouting at each other across a boardroom table, that's the trouble. Walter turned to look at her, his expression open in a way it hadn't been even during his confession about the newspaper clipping. You have a rare gift, Maria, for reminding people of the things they already know, but have forgotten how to feel. I imagine your children are very lucky. I don't feel lucky most days, Maria admitted with a tired laugh. Most days, I feel like I'm barely keeping the lights on. And yet you kept them on for me too, this week, without a second thought. He reached over and patted her hand once, briefly, an old-fashioned gesture that felt entirely natural coming from him. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever my son says or does when he finds out where I've been, I want you to know that this week, in this small apartment, has meant more to me than I know how to properly express. Maria felt an unexpected lump rise in her throat, and she nodded rather than trusting her voice, and the two of them sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, before finally saying goodnight. She lay awake long after the apartment had gone dark, thinking about everything Walter had told her, about a son who'd grown into a stranger, about a father too proud and too frightened to build the bridge back, about the strange, unlikely week that had brought a struggling single mother and a lonely billionaire together under one small cluttered roof. She thought about her landlord's warning, about reporters who might come looking, about whatever storm tomorrow might bring, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came next, she and Walter would face it the same way they'd faced the blizzard that first night, together and without apology. She had no way of knowing, drifting finally into sleep, just how soon that storm would arrive, or how loudly it would knock on her door. Morning came with gray light filtering through thin curtains, and Maria was in the middle of making breakfast, flipping eggs, while Lily set the table, and Noah searched for his missing shoe, when a car pulled up outside that didn't belong on this street. It was long, black, and polished, entirely out of place among the older sedans and rusting pickup trucks that usually lined the block, and Maria felt her stomach tighten the moment she glanced out the window and saw it idling at the curb. Walter, standing at the counter with a mug of coffee, followed her gaze and went very still. "That's Daniel's car," he said quietly. Before Maria could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. 3 hard raps that carried none of the hesitation Mr. Carter's knock had carried days before. This was the knock of someone who had spent a full week worried sick, who had finally tracked down the one clue that led here, and who was not going to leave without answers. Maria set down the spatula, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked toward the door, aware of Walter behind her, bracing himself for a reunion he had spent 5 days avoiding, and one that neither of them could put off any longer. She opened the door to find a man in his 40s standing in the hallway, his coat expensive but rumpled, his eyes shadowed with the particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. He looked past Maria the moment the door opened, his gaze locking onto Walter standing in the kitchen doorway, and for a long, frozen second, neither man said a word. "Dad," Daniel's voice cracked on the single syllable. Relief and fury tangled together so tightly, Maria couldn't tell which emotion would win out. "You've been here this whole time? A week, Dad. A week. And you couldn't call, couldn't send a message, couldn't let anyone know you were alive?" "Daniel, I had people searching hospitals. I had people checking with the police, checking morgues, Dad. Morgues, do you have any idea what that week was like for me?" His voice had risen now, filling the small apartment, and Maria saw Lily shrink back toward the kitchen counter, her eyes wide. "Maybe we should step outside," Maria said quietly, moving toward Daniel with the same calm authority she used to settle disputes between customers at the diner. "Or sit down at least. This doesn't need to happen in front of the children." Daniel seemed to notice her fully for the first time, his eyes flicking over her apartment, the modest furniture, the children now huddled near the kitchen table, and something in his expression shifted, confusion cutting through his anger.
"Who are you? What is this place?"
"My name is Maria. I found your father on a bench outside during the storm last week, freezing and alone. I brought him here to warm up, and he's been staying with us since, while we tried to figure out what he needed." Daniel's jaw worked silently for a moment, processing this, and then his eyes went back to his father. "You were staying with strangers, in some apartment, while I tore the city apart looking for you?" "They weren't strangers to me for long," Walter said quietly, stepping forward now, some of his usual composure returning even as his voice remained gentle. "Daniel, please, sit down. Let me explain." They moved to the small living room, Daniel perched stiffly on the edge of the couch, Walter across from him in the armchair, Maria hovering near the doorway, uncertain whether to stay or give them privacy, until Walter caught her eye and gestured for her to remain. Noah and Lily she sent to their room despite their obvious curiosity, promising to explain everything later. "I left because of what happened between us," Walter began, his hands folded in his lap. "The argument, about the sale. I said things I shouldn't have said, called you names I've regretted every day since. I walked out because I was too proud to apologize immediately, and I told myself a walk would clear my head. I didn't intend to disappear for a week. The storm caught me off guard, and by the time I realized how much trouble I was in, this woman found me and took me in. You could have called me. Any point in the last week, you could have called. I know, I should have. I was ashamed, Daniel. Ashamed of the things I'd said, ashamed of how badly I'd handled everything, and some foolish, stubborn part of me thought that if I just had a little more time to think, I could come back with a real solution, instead of more angry words. Walter's voice wavered slightly, the first crack of real emotion showing through. That wasn't fair to you. I understand that now. I'm sorry. Daniel sat with that for a long moment, some of the anger in his shoulders easing, though not disappearing entirely. You scared me, Dad. I know we don't agree on much these days, but you scared me half to death. I know, and I'm sorrier for that than for anything about the argument itself. Walter looked at his son directly, something raw and honest in his expression that Maria hadn't seen from him even during his confession to her the night before. I've spent this past week in a home with very little money and a great deal of warmth, watching a mother work herself to exhaustion for her children without a single word of complaint, watching two kids find joy in the smallest things, a homework problem solved, a story read aloud, a simple dinner shared together. It made me think a great deal about what I've built, Daniel, and what I might have lost along the way in the building of it. Dad, if this is about the company again, it's about you, Walter said firmly. Not the sale, not the board, not the balance sheets. You, Daniel. When did we stop talking about anything else? The question seemed to land harder than anything else said in the room so far, and Daniel's carefully controlled expression finally cracked, something younger and more vulnerable showing through the exhausted businessman sitting stiffly on Maria's couch. I don't know, he admitted quietly. Sometime after Mom died, I think. It got easier to talk about numbers than about anything that actually hurt. Yes, Walter said softly. I think you're right about that. Maria, still standing near the doorway, felt like an intruder on something deeply private, and she began to step back toward the kitchen to give them space. But Daniel's eyes found her before she could leave. You took him in, he said. A complete stranger, in a storm, and you just took him in, fed him, gave him a place to sleep, for a week. He needed help, Maria said simply. That's all it was. Do you have any idea who he is, what he's worth? I didn't, that first night. I found out a few days later. She met Daniel's gaze steadily. It didn't change anything for me. A person needing help is a person needing help, whether they've got a fortune waiting for them at home or nothing at all. Something in Daniel's expression shifted again, softer this time, and he looked between Maria and his father with an expression that suggested he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find at the end of this frantic, frightening week. I don't know many people who'd say that and mean it, he said quietly. Especially not people who look like they're barely scraping by themselves. We manage, Maria said, the same words she'd offered Walter that first morning, and something about repeating them now, to this stranger who so clearly loved his father even through his anger, felt like closing a small circle. The conversation that followed lasted the better part of an hour, unfolding slowly as father and son worked through years of accumulated distance in halting, imperfect sentences. Daniel explained his side of the argument, the pressure from the board, the genuine fear that the company would collapse entirely if they didn't modernize and streamline, the frustration of watching his father cling to a version of the business that no longer matched the world it operated in. Walter listened, really listened, in a way Maria suspected he hadn't managed to do during their original argument, and slowly, painstakingly, something like understanding began to take shape between them. Not agreement exactly, but the first real conversation they'd had in longer than either of them could remember. I'm not saying yes to the sale, Walter said eventually, not the way it's currently structured, but I am saying I'm willing to listen properly, to actually hear your proposal, instead of dismissing it the moment you open your mouth. That's more than I offered you a week ago, and I'm sorry it took nearly freezing to death in a snowstorm to get me here. Daniel managed a small, tired laugh, the tension in his shoulders finally easing fully for the first time since he'd walked through the door. I'll take it. It's more than I expected when I got in the car this morning. As the conversation wound down, Daniel's gaze drifted around the small apartment again, taking in the worn furniture, the stack of bills on the counter that Maria hadn't managed to hide in time, the careful, threadbare comfort of a home built on very little and stretched to cover a great deal. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier edge entirely. I don't know how to thank you properly, he said to Maria, for taking care of him, for not calling the police the moment you found out who he was, and trying to cash in on it somehow. I've met plenty of people in my line of work who would have. I wasn't looking for a thank you, Maria said. I just did what anyone should have done. Not anyone would have, Walter said quietly, echoing the words he'd said to her days before. That's rather the point, Daniel. That's what I've been trying to explain to you. Daniel looked between them once more, something thoughtful crossing his face, and Maria had the distinct sense, though she couldn't have said exactly why, that this quiet moment in her cluttered living room was about to set something larger into motion, something neither she nor Walter had fully anticipated when he first stepped through her door 5 days ago, half frozen and utterly alone. Before Daniel left that afternoon, he asked to speak with Noah and Lily, and Maria, watching from the kitchen, felt her guard soften as she saw this stiff, exhausted businessman kneel down to Lily's level and thank her seriously for taking care of his father, as though she were a grown woman, rather than a 7-year-old with marker stains on her fingers. Noah shook his hand with the solemnity of a much older boy, and for a moment, the small apartment felt full in a way it rarely did, crowded with people who had, against every likelihood, become important to one another in the span of a single strange week. I'll be in touch, Daniel told his father at the door, a promise that carried none of the coldness it might have carried a week earlier. Soon, not just about the company, about everything. I'd like that, Walter said, and Maria saw real hope in his face, the kind of hope that had clearly been missing for longer than just this past week. After Daniel's car pulled away from the curb, the apartment settled into a strange, quiet stillness, the aftermath of a storm that had passed through and left something rearranged in its wake. Walter stood by the window for a long time, watching the empty street where the black car had been, and Maria let him have the silence, busying herself with the dishes from breakfast that had gone cold and forgotten during the confrontation. Thank you, he said eventually, coming to stand in the kitchen doorway. For not letting me hide from that. For pushing me to make the calls, even when I wanted nothing more than to stay quiet a little longer. You did the hard part, Maria said. I just gave you a nudge. A nudge that likely saved my relationship with my only son. I don't think I'll ever be able to properly repay that. He hesitated, then added, though I intend to try, if you'll let me. You don't owe me anything, Walter. That's not why I did any of this. I know that. It's precisely why I intend to do it anyway. Something resolved settled into his expression, the same quiet certainty she'd seen in him during their conversation about facing his son. I've had a great deal of time to think this week, Maria, about what actually matters, about the kind of life I want to spend my remaining years living. I don't want to simply write a check and disappear back into my old life as though none of this happened. I'd like to remain part of your family's life, if that's something you and the children would welcome. Maria dried her hands slowly, considering the offer, the strange, unlikely shape their week together had taken. The kids adore you, she said finally. I think they'd be thrilled. And you? I've grown rather fond of having you around too, she admitted, a small smile tugging at her mouth. Even with all the excitement your family brings along with it. Over the following days, Walter's presence in the apartment took on a different quality. No longer the careful secrecy of a man hiding his true identity, but something more settled and open. He still helped Noah with homework and read to Lily before bed, but now he did so as himself, fully himself, no longer flinching at questions about his past or catching himself mid-sentence before revealing too much. He told the children stories about the factories he'd built, about the workers he considered friends after decades together, about the son he was slowly, carefully rebuilding a relationship with, one phone call and one visit at a time. Daniel came by twice more that first week after their reunion, each visit a little easier than the last, the stiffness between father and son gradually softening into something that looked, Maria thought, remarkably like the beginning of real trust. On his second visit, he brought a small toy for Lily and a book about engineering for Noah, gifts that seemed to acknowledge, without saying so directly, that these two children had somehow become part of the fabric of his father's life, and by extension, part of his own. Mr. Carter, Maria's landlord, showed up once more during that stretch of days, prepared with the same clipboard and the same complaints about extended guests, only to find Walter Bennett himself answering the door, dressed now in clothes that clearly belonged to a man of his actual means, a car waiting at the curb that made Mr. Carter's earlier assumptions about Unit 6's complaints suddenly seem very small indeed. The conversation that followed was brief, and Mr. Carter left considerably more polite than he'd arrived, muttering something about taking care of the noise complaint himself and not troubling Maria about it further. That was unnecessary, Maria said once the landlord had gone, though she couldn't quite hide her amusement. Perhaps, Walter said, a rare mischievous glint in his eye, but I've found that a man's willingness to bully a struggling mother tends to evaporate rather quickly when he realizes she has friends with resources. I don't feel especially guilty about that. Maria laughed, despite herself, and the sound of it, easy and unguarded, seemed to please Walter more than anything else that had happened all week. It was on a quiet evening near the end of that second week, the children already asleep and the apartment settled into its familiar late-night calm, that Walter brought up the subject that would change everything again, this time in a way Maria never could have anticipated, when she first wrapped her scarf around a shivering stranger's neck on a snow-covered bench. I want to talk to you about something, he said, setting down his tea carefully. Something I've been considering since that first night you brought me here, though I didn't have the words for it until recently. That sounds serious, Maria said, settling into the chair across from him. It is, in a way, though I hope you'll find it a good kind of serious. Walter folded his hands in his lap, the same careful, deliberate gesture she'd come to associate with him, choosing his words with great precision. You gave me something this past week that money has never quite managed to buy me, Maria. A home that felt like a home. Children who asked for nothing except my attention and my stories. A woman who looked past every complication I carried in and simply asked whether I was warm enough. I don't intend to let that generosity go unanswered, no matter how many times you insist you don't want anything in return. Walter, let me finish, please. He held up a hand gently, and something in his eyes made her pause. I've spent my whole life building something enormous, and in the process, I let a great many smaller, more important things slip away from me. I'd like the chance to build something different now, something that matters in a quieter way, and I believe you're the right person to help me do that, if you're willing. Maria sat very still, unsure what exactly he was proposing, but certain from the weight in his voice that whatever it was, it would carry them both far beyond the small, familiar walls of this apartment where their strange friendship had begun. I'm not talking about charity, Walter said, seeing the wariness creep into her expression. I know you well enough by now to understand you'd refuse that outright, and honestly, I'd respect you for it. What I'm proposing is different. A partnership, if you're willing to consider it that way. I don't understand, Maria admitted. A partnership in what, exactly? I don't have anything to offer a man in your position. You have more than you realize. Walter leaned forward slightly. You told me once, that first week, about a dream you'd set aside years ago, a small diner of your own. Do you remember telling me that? Maria's breath caught. She had mentioned it, briefly, one exhausted evening after a particularly hard shift, the old dream of running her own place, instead of working herself to the bone for someone else's business. A dream she'd folded away so long ago she'd nearly forgotten she'd ever said it aloud to him. That was just tired talk, she said. Something people say when they're exhausted and dreaming out loud. It's not realistic. I don't have the capital, the credit, any of what it would take. I do, Walter said simply. And I have decades of experience building something out of nothing, which, as it happens, is precisely what starting a small business requires. I'd like to invest in that diner, Maria, properly, as a business partner, not as a favor. You'd run it. You'd make every decision about the menu, the staff, the atmosphere. I'd simply provide the funding to get it off the ground, and perhaps, if you'd have me, a bit of guidance now and then, from someone who's made every mistake there is to make in building a company from scratch. Maria stared at him, too stunned to speak for a long moment. Walter, that's an enormous amount of money you're talking about. It's an amount that means very little to me, and would mean everything to you and your children. I don't say that to diminish what I'm offering, only to be honest about the imbalance. But Maria, I want you to understand something clearly. This isn't a debt I'm trying to erase with money, because that feels simpler than genuine gratitude. This is me recognizing real talent, real work ethic, and a real dream that deserves the chance to become something more than tired talk after a long shift. You would have found your way there eventually, I suspect, with or without me. I'd simply like to help it happen sooner, and help it happen well. Maria felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, and she wiped at them quickly, embarrassed by how easily the offer had cracked something open in her chest. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Walter said gently. Or say you'll think about it, if yes feels too large a word right now. Either way, know that the offer isn't going anywhere, and it isn't contingent on anything except your willingness to let an old man be useful to a family that gave him back something he thought he'd lost for good. She didn't say yes that night. It felt too large, too fast, and Maria had spent enough years being careful about promises and windfalls to know that big decisions deserved careful thought rather than an emotional response in the quiet hours after a hard conversation. But she thought about it constantly over the following days, turning the offer over in her mind while she worked her shifts at the diner, while she helped Noah with his math homework, while she tucked Lily into bed each night with stories that no longer felt quite so far removed from the strange, wonderful turn her family's life had taken. She talked it over with Grace during a slow afternoon at the diner, laying out the whole situation from the beginning: the storm, the bench, the newspaper clipping, the confrontation with Daniel, and finally, the offer that had left her sleepless for 3 nights running. Maria, Grace set down the coffee pot and stared at her friend with something between disbelief and delight. You're asking me whether you should let a legitimate billionaire fund your dream diner because you're worried it's too good to be true? I'm worried about what it means to owe someone that much, Maria admitted. About what happens if things go wrong, if I can't make it work, if I end up disappointing him after everything. Honey, from everything you've told me, that man doesn't sound like he's looking for a guaranteed return on investment. He sounds like a lonely old man who found a family worth being part of, and this is his way of making sure he stays part of it. Grace reached over and squeezed her hand. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else, without asking for anything back. Maybe it's time you let someone take care of you for a change, even if it looks different than you expected. Maria carried those words with her for the rest of the week, and slowly, the fear that had wrapped itself around Walter's offer began to loosen its grip, replaced by something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like genuine hope. There was one more conversation, though, that Maria needed to have before she could give Walter her answer, and it happened on a cold evening, much like the one that had started everything, though this time, no storm raged outside, only a light, gentle snow that dusted the windowsill without any of the earlier danger. She sat with Noah and Lily at the kitchen table, laying out the offer in terms they could understand, explaining what it might mean for their family, the risks as well as the possibilities. You'd be working even more, Noah said thoughtfully, older than his years in the way children raised by hard-working single parents often are. At least at first. Setting up a whole diner sounds like a lot. It would be a lot, Maria agreed, but it would also mean, eventually, that I'm working for us instead of for someone else, that the hours I put in build something that's actually ours. Would Walter still come around after? Lily asked, her small face serious, in a way that made Maria's chest tighten. Or would he go back to his old life and forget about us? Maria considered the question carefully, unwilling to make promises on Walter's behalf that weren't hers to make, but certain enough of what she'd witnessed over the past weeks to answer honestly. I don't think Walter could forget about us if he tried, she said, but that's a fair thing to worry about, baby. People change their minds sometimes, especially people with complicated lives like his. All we can do is trust what we've seen so far, and hope it stays true. Both children seemed satisfied with that answer, and by the end of the conversation, their earlier hesitation had given way to genuine excitement at the idea of a family diner, Noah already sketching out ideas for a logo on a scrap of paper, Lily asking whether she could help name the menu items. Watching them, Maria felt the last of her own hesitation finally give way as well, replaced by something steady and certain that had nothing to do with the size of Walter's fortune and everything to do with the kind of man he'd shown himself to be over these past weeks, patient and honest, and utterly transformed from the frightened stranger who had shown up on her doorstep. She said yes on a Sunday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after that first snowy night, sitting across from Walter at her kitchen table, with the children playing quietly in the next room. He didn't celebrate loudly or make a fuss, simply reached across the table and shook her hand with the same seriousness he might have used to close a business deal worth millions, though the warmth in his eyes told her he understood exactly how much this particular deal meant, far beyond any number attached to it. The months that followed moved quickly, filled with the kind of purposeful busyness Maria had never experienced before, the good kind, the kind built on excitement rather than exhaustion. Walter connected her with a contractor he trusted. A small commercial space became available 2 blocks from her old apartment, and slowly, carefully, with Walter's guidance but always with Maria's final say, a small diner began to take shape where an old hardware store had once stood. Noah spent his weekends helping paint walls and choosing paint colors with an artist's seriousness that surprised everyone, including himself. Lily designed the menu covers with crayon drawings that Maria insisted on keeping exactly as they were, imperfect and full of color, framed and hung near the entrance where every customer would see them first. Daniel visited more often than any of them expected, offering practical advice about permits and licensing that came from years of navigating far larger business ventures, and somewhere along the way, without anyone quite noticing when it happened, he stopped being Walter's estranged son and became simply Daniel, a regular presence at Sunday dinners and diner planning meetings alike. The diner opened on a bright spring morning, 6 months after the storm that had brought Walter to Maria's door, with a modest sign above the entrance that read simply, Maria's Table. No mention of the wealthy investor who had made it possible, exactly as Maria had insisted from the very beginning. People should come here because the food is good and the welcome is warm, she'd told Walter firmly when he'd suggested otherwise, not because of whose money built the walls. Fair enough, he'd agreed, though he made sure, quietly and without her knowledge until much later, that a small brass plaque was installed near the kitchen door, visible only to staff, reading a single line, for the woman who stopped for a stranger in the snow. On opening day, the diner filled with customers from morning until well past closing time, drawn by word of mouth about the warm, generous woman who ran the place, and the food that tasted like it had been made with real care, rather than mere obligation. Walter arrived just before the lunch rush, dressed simply, no longer trying to hide who he was, but no longer needing to announce it either, and took his seat at the small corner table that had quietly become his, the same table he would occupy several times a week for years afterward, always ordering the same simple soup that reminded him, he told anyone who asked, of the very first meal a stranger had ever given him, without expecting anything in return. Noah worked the register on weekends once he turned old enough, learning the value of hard work the same way his mother had learned it, one careful transaction at a time. Lily grew up practically inside the diner's walls, greeting regular customers by name before she'd even started elementary school, her crayon drawings still hanging proudly by the door, long after she'd learned to draw far more sophisticated pictures. And Walter, who had walked out into a snowstorm one terrible night, intending only to clear his head, found instead an entire second family waiting for him on the other side of that storm, a family that asked nothing of him except his presence, his stories, and his willingness to keep showing up, week after week, year after year, at the small corner table in the diner that bore no name but Maria's own. Years later, when people asked Maria how she'd managed to build something as successful and beloved as her little diner, she rarely mentioned the investment or the connections or any of the practical details that had made it possible. Instead, she told them about a freezing night, a man alone on a bench, and the simple, unshakable belief that nobody, rich or poor, familiar or strange, should ever be left alone in the cold if there was any way at all to help. It was, she always said, the best decision she ever made, though at the time, standing in that blizzard with her scarf already halfway around a stranger's shoulders, she hadn't been thinking about decisions at all. She'd simply been doing what felt right, the way she always had, and the way she always would, long after the storm had passed, and an entire new life had bloomed in its wake.